I'm sure everyone is well aware of what's going on with JBS. It's been all over the news lately. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive in, Bogdan. And first and foremost, I can't help but wonder about how the target for ransomware it seems to me like it's changed over the past year or so. So have you noticed a change in the target as well?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because these types of attacks, they occur all the time. What we see in the news, I think, is a very small fraction of what's really going on in the landscape in terms of these types of hacks. But it's becoming very clear that the malicious actors, the attackers, whatever you want to call them, they're becoming more bold. They're starting to realize that they're able to compromise organizations and companies that maybe have a heavier impact on the potential economy. We saw that with Colonial Pipeline not too long ago, recently JBS and even last year with SolarWinds, and earlier this year what happened with Microsoft Exchange and Hafnium. So I think it's almost as if it's like a tiering step ladder of not only boldness but ransom demands as well. As these organizations are starting, or these malware actors are starting to realize that, hey, we don't have to just target the companies just to walk away with a payday. We can potentially target institutions or companies or organizations that maybe have a heavier hold and make bigger demands, because those demands will most likely be met because of the impact that will occur when they're down for too long because of a ransomware attack or some sort of other data breach. And I think it's important to know that, in past years we've seen big hacks. I mean, things like Equifax and large hacks like that, where large amounts of data was exfiltrated and leaked on the dark web. But really, you start looking at the impact that Colonial Pipeline had and how long they were down, and JBS. Granted, JBS was able to respond much quicker, but the sheer effect that has on the economy was much greater than the data breach that Equifax experienced, for example. So yeah, I think the landscape is changing drastically, but I also think that everything that's been going on up until now is still going on, but we have seen an uptick in activity with attacks, against almost any organization that's going to have a weak link that'll either click on that link and download something malicious to their environment, or organizations that maybe don't take the correct due diligence and secure their externally facing environment.
So, Bogdan, you speak a few different languages, including Russian and Ukrainian, which is a common language that hackers speak in, especially on the dark web. So I was wondering, I know that you spend some time on the dark web reading into chat groups, and I was wondering what kinds of things you've come across in those chat groups.
Yeah, it's interesting being able to read and understand the context of a lot of these communications that go on, even on just the Clearnet, what we would call, not the dark web, but just shady forums, shady communication channels. Like recently, I read an article just a number of weeks ago that mentioned that Telegram is kind of like the new cove for malware actors, where it's encrypted, it's anonymous, it's a great way to share and contribute and communicate on potential hacks, potential targets. And one of the things I've seen is very interesting. It's almost as if there's been a bit of a hive mind, where a lot of these attackers are getting together. They're mining data off of other resources, other trusted forums on help with compliance, on technical implementation of security solutions and things like that. And they're using that information to get an idea of where organizations are struggling with a lot of the implementations, a lot of the compliance and regulations that are recently coming out. And how do we comply with this, with these items? How do we implement these technical controls that, say, NIST or HIPAA, high-tech demand us to implement, and they use that information to build an intelligence database. Granted, I'm not sure what this database looks like, but really it kind of looks like it's really just a bunch of forum posts or a bunch of chats within a lot of these groups, and they use that as a means of sharing information or even teaming up against certain targets. And it's very interesting because anyone can go on LinkedIn, for example, purchase a premium or business subscription and search for almost anyone within an organization with a specific title. It doesn't require you to have any sort of validation of legitimacy or anything like that. Anyone can do that in the same way that anyone can go into Office 365 and purchase a legitimate tenant and then use that to spread malware or malicious emails. So some things that we've been seeing recently, on a lot of these forums is that there's been a lot of collaboration. In the same way that we're chatting right now about this, they get together like this as well, maybe granted without the cameras and all that, and they talk strategy, because it is a business model for them. So,
well, that leads me into another thought. While they're ganging up on all of us, I can't help but wonder, like, there's a lot of companies that have implemented shadow policies and procedures. So can you explain a little bit about what that is and how that's played perhaps a role in some of the recent hacks?
Yeah, that's something we've seen, something I've seen firsthand with a number of incident response projects that I've done, or even just penetration testing and vulnerability management, is that it's almost as if, and it's not to maybe blame organizations or their compliance officers or anything, but it's almost as if they're being overwhelmed. And there's a big demand of policies, procedures, and compliance with all sorts of regulations, with all sorts of frameworks, and they kind of go about it, setting all that up, maybe even using templates that are available through NIST or the Center for Internet Security or something like that, and then they implement them, tell everyone about them, but they're never really examined. They're never really applied technically, or even or maybe even perform like a tabletop exercise to actually see how they play out and see if it's actually applicable to their organization. So one thing that we've seen is the implementation of, say, HIPAA or high-tech policies, or even CCPA. That's a great example. The California Consumer Privacy Act, I believe it's like SB 1386 or something like that, if my memory serves me right. And it's really just a policy that talks about that consumers have a right to know which data you're holding. They have a right to have the data deleted, and they have the right to request the data from you. So a lot of organizations are kind of scrambling as to how to implement this. And something that I've seen recently is like, okay, the implementation of it within email is to essentially not allow any of that data to escape the organization through the use of like a data loss prevention policy, where it's very easy to maybe implement that, but are you testing it? Is it being tested on a regular basis? Do you have a scheduled rotation of testing? How do you know it's working, and how can you prove it other than just checking the checkbox? So what we mean by shadow policies is really just, hey, it's there, it's checking the checkbox, but it's not actually maybe doing anything. And the thing is that it may be, but there's no documented evidence or proof that it's doing something within the organization.
You had shared the other day, like, a recent example of this is, it looks like they might have gotten in through a VPN.
This article was saying that it was believed to be that there was an unsecured VPN server at Colonial Pipeline. Now that was targeted by the actors, and I guess the initial means of compromise, or that they were able to get into that network in an unauthenticated manner. And realistically, I mean, if you have any externally facing system, those systems need to be tested at minimum on a semi-annual basis, where you're performing a vulnerability scan, any sort of vulnerability management process. any sort of risk management, where you're scanning, you're hiring third-party penetration testers to really take a look at your environment externally and identify these potential issues, even if it's something as simple as a encryption thing, or a transport security thing. So you're using TLS 1.0 as opposed to the latest TLS 1.2, things like that. And then having a process and procedure in place to take that information and actually implement the solutions, and then have the pen testers test it again with like a retest or a remediation test to validate those changes and validate that those items have been remediated and are can then be declared as secure moving forward. Granted, you can't always account for, say, 0 days or vulnerabilities that haven't been publicly discovered yet, but we have to take whatever steps we can to mitigate the risks that we do know of. And I think not doing that is negligence on our side, and which could lead to what we saw with Colonial Pipeline.
So if it was really that they gained entry through the VPN, then as a pen tester, that's one of the first things that you look at is how to break into the system. I think you called it the attack surface. So it makes me wonder if they were having an annual pen test done, because that would have surfaced pretty quickly. That's one of the pen testing 101 or something along those lines, right? So
today's landscape with so many remote workers, everyone working remote, a lot of these organizations and companies, they ended up spooling up and propping up VPN and remote access systems and servers, in a whim, kind of last minute, just so they can still operate amongst everything else going on when the country is under lockdown. And and I've noticed that a lot of those implementations I haven't been looked at since. Or it's a pen test, a vulnerability scan would have definitely caught at least all the major issues, anything that's publicly known. Even something like a configuration audit would have been great, whereas you're checking the actual checkboxes and the configurations that are set up for these devices or systems, and see if they comply with maybe the industry best practices, or just best practices that an MSSP would declare as secure.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, especially since everyone's been working from home for basically a year now. So that's an entire year, where you should have had a pen test by now. Like, you've worked with a lot of different businesses after they've suffered attacks of various types, and so I'm sure that often you've come on site when a business didn't have an incident response plan in place. I was just kind of wondering what kind of impact it has on the organization when they don't have a plan in place.
Yeah, when they don't have a plan in place, actually my favorite story, and I think I maybe mentioned it to you before, is you showing up to an incident response case. I show up. Immediately, I'm talking to the IT manager and their information security officer, and I'm like, "All right, where's your incident response plan? Let's go through it, see who we need to talk to and contact." And they kind of both look at me and they're like, "You're our incident response plan." And I'll never forget that. And really, one thing that I've noticed in those situations that's a common thread is that it's really disorganized, and a lot of times, typically a lot more damage is caused because the response is first off delayed, and second off, typically it's approached incorrectly, because IT folks will just start shutting systems down. They'll start formatting drives. They'll kind of like doing your panic work, when in reality, if the plan was in place, if the plan was reviewed, tested, analyzed by the team, so everyone kind of knew their role. Typically in those environments, your goal is just to contain the threat. You're unplugging switches, unplugging servers where the threat exists, and then pulling in, either if the organization is large enough, you're pulling in a internal IR team, or you're pulling in a third-party vendor that has an IR team on call 24/7 to come in and kind of handle it. At that point, without the IR plan, you're kind of making the plan up as you go, and that sounds bad, but that's really your only other choice. So at that point, it's crucial to have a vendor that knows what they're doing. If you're going with a third-party incident response vendor, and they can typically take approaches that they've taken for other incidents that's similar to this organization in particular. If it's ransomware, then it's ransomware. Typically, they follow the same path. If it's business email compromise, a lot of it's very similar. And they can take what they know, they can take a plan or a template that they already have and kind of follow that as a means of getting you back online. And then they're going to strongly advise that you learn from your mistakes, review what happened, and then put a plan into place so that the response is much quicker moving forward. And plus it gets more expensive, I noticed. It definitely gets more expensive to the victim organization if they have no plan in place, because then the vendor or if the insurance gets involved, the cybersecurity insurance, they have to pull in a vendor, then they have to do a lot of the heavy lifting with figuring out, okay, who do we talk to, who do we reach out to, where's your compliance, where's your legal counsel, what are your notification requirements, what type of data do you store, does it belong on one server, or is it okay that it exists on everyone's workstation, and things like that. It starts getting very, very, very complex. So having a plan in place will essentially force you to not only know how to respond to certain incidents, but it'll also help you identify where your data exists in your environment. If you're working with credit card data, does it exist only on the server it's supposed to, or do you have employees that try to make their life 2 minutes easier and they copy that data on their local workstation? So now you have credit card data on the local workstation that if that workstation got compromised, you got notification requirements, you have all sorts of concerns. So, you're going to answer a lot of questions that any compliance regulatory framework or audit is going to ask you of as you put together your plan together, which will put you in a much better position for even attracting business. I mean, if you have a plan in place, you can market that. We've seen organizations do that as well, and it definitely provides a level of integrity and confidence in an organization. So,
with working with companies that have an IR plan in place, are there ever shortcomings with their plan? Any room for improvement that you've come across?
Yeah, definitely. I think an IR plan has to be a living, breathing document. It's something that should be reviewed on a consistent basis, updated on a consistent basis. Even if there's no real maybe content updates, at least updating, making sure that the contacts within an IR plan are updated. One thing that we've seen in the past is showing up at a IR project, looking at the plan and realizing that the first 4 contacts that they had labeled for what to do or who to call in the event of a data breach no longer worked at the organization. And the 5th one was on vacation or something. There's no way of getting a hold of them, and things like that. So you definitely want to be proactive in making sure your IR plan is updated, making sure that it's reviewed on a daily basis. And something that we've seen that's very beneficial is performing tabletop exercises, which essentially means, hey, we're going to simulate an incident, a data breach. Let's follow the plan. And as you follow the plan, typically this is performed with like your IR vendor or an internal IR team and your legal counsel and compliance and HR. And as you go through the plan, typically you're going to identify areas where you have gaps that maybe you're not directly taking into account what type of data you're working with or where the data is stored and how to respond with the data. And we've seen instances where even legal had to really start thinking about, okay, are we sharpened on our notification requirements if something were to happen? And it really just benefits the entire team and the entire organization. So having a plan is definitely huge. And then just generally the response is much better. So in the event of an actual data breach or incident, if a plan is in place and the IT folks and the system admins or the security team knows about it, that's an important key, because we've had projects before where like, yeah, I know we have an RIR plan, I'm not sure where it's at. I'm still looking for it. It might be encrypted somewhere. Things like that. Like you need to maybe even have it printed out, physical form. The hackers can't encrypt your physical binder of your plan, and know where it's at. Make sure people are aware of where it's at. Make sure people are trained on how to read it, how to understand and comprehend it, and follow the process that's written therein. So, yep.
Well, Bogdan, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to meet with me and answer all of my questions.